Hey guys, what's up? This is Stock Retail coming back to you. A little bit of a different topic today. Many of you are used to following me on topics concerning AMC and movies, but from time to time, certainly I've talked about Bitcoin quite a bit over the last year and a half. MicroStrategy has just been sort of front and center. Obviously, Saylor is one of the faces of Bitcoin, I'll kind of say. And there's a lot of interesting discussion and even perhaps controversy and debate around how much Bitcoin MicroStrategy has been purchasing, how they're funding that. There are accusations out there about them being a Ponzi scheme. I've seen some pretty significant shorts weigh in and have some discussion on this. And then even in the AMC community, there was a bit of back and forth between myself and some others. Some people who sort of took the side of the shorts and said this is a Ponzi scheme, and those same people sort of celebrating things like XRP. Me, on the other hand, having some discussions about why it's not a Ponzi scheme. And so I guess I just want to show today a little bit about MicroStrategy and ground anybody who follows me in some facts and take a look at, just is this a Ponzi scheme? What would it take to be a Ponzi scheme? What's the value of MicroStrategy? Is it, something people would short? Is it something actually people would go long on? And just kind of, I don't know, do a little bit of a fact check like I always do. So the first thing is, I mentioned it's pretty interesting to see who is kind of against Saylor. So you had Citron come out and say that MicroStrategy was overvalued. And so we'll kind of talk about that. I'm showing you, actually, it's a little bit cut off, but in the middle, this is back in 2021, but Ken Griffen basically said Ethereum would overtake Bitcoin and that Bitcoin wasn't very good and eventually would kind of go away. So obviously he's been pretty wrong on that one. And Jamie Dimon also, ended up pretty wrong, said Bitcoin is basically a pet rock and that he would stay away. I always found that interesting. I have said I don't think that he would have bothered being on social media with us, but it was interesting that one of the main shorts through 2021 and 2022, who kind of seemed a bit of a pit boss, had the name Pet Rock. There was an account that if you were in AMC, you dealt with that account for a while. So that was kind of interesting. But just to kind of see the bedfellows of sorts of who is sort of anti-Bitcoin, anti-Saylor. It's an interesting group, and I'm using interesting as almost a slur in this case because these are not people that I respect or whose opinions I would value. So I guess I found that odd. That was the first thing that, I don't know, a month or two ago when people came out, very loudly, maybe 2 or 3 months ago, in particular when Citron came out. And I just thought, well, this is really weird to see people who have been fighting shorts for years who ended up siding with these guys. And I found that very odd as well and sort of telling, in my opinion. But we're still speaking in speculation, so let's speak in fact here. There's a lot of leveling of the accusation of being a Ponzi scheme. So I want anyone who follows me to really understand what a Ponzi scheme is. And granted, this is just a screenshot from Investopedia. I'm not suggesting Investopedia will give you deep DD, but it can be a launching off point, and I found this definition to be pretty good. A fraudulent scheme that involves paying existing investors in a non-existent enterprise with funds collected from new investors. So, some of the definitions of a Ponzi scheme is effectively I need to be taking in money into my right hand so I can pay people over on my left hand. And there's really no business model to speak of. There's no real value of assets, or certainly not enough to support what's going on and sort of the returns that are being promised to people. Now, a lot of us might believe that there are some hedge funds who operate this way, and certainly brokers who are, FTDs are very much in the conversation right now in AMC and GameStop. If you haven't seen, I've got a whole playlist on FTDs. Go check that out sometime. But so interesting to see this Ponzi accusation being leveled, and I don't know where it came from was basically, you've seen that MicroStrategy keeps doing share offerings and convertible debt. If you don't know, convertible bonds basically can become shares in the future. If the bondholder decides to exercise their rights, they can flip those into shares. Often there are restrictions around that, rules around that. And I'm going to talk about that too, because I think what some people are saying is, oh man, MicroStrategy is so over leveraged. They're going into huge debt to buy all this Bitcoin. What happens if Bitcoin dips, et cetera, et cetera. Now, first off, I'm not going to bet against Saylor, who already went through sort of the FTX, Sam Bankman um, attack, I'll call it, on Bitcoin. Saylor already survived that. I think he's going to be fine from here on out. But we will look a little further here. And so I just think it's a little ridiculous to call it a Ponzi scheme when, even by definition, what we need to look at is, does MicroStrategy have a business, and does MicroStrategy hold assets? Because if it does hold those things, then it's by definition not a Ponzi scheme. Now, you could still argue, is it overvalued? That's what shorts, if they want to be real and don't want to be manipulators, then they just have to make a thesis, a case on the value of it. And we're going to look at that too. So, first off, you need to know how many Bitcoins even that MicroStrategy holds. So, I just imaged here, I said, are they kind of catching a wave with Bitcoin? We'll talk about that in a minute too. So MicroStrategy holds almost 450,000 Bitcoins right now. There's an actual asset on the balance sheet that they are holding. That needs to not be ignored. And so here's some scenarios. So MicroStrategy has 243 million shares. You can see at the top a little more than that. And so at various prices of Bitcoin, how much is that Bitcoin worth? So if they're holding these 446,000 Bitcoin, then at 100,000, which we're hovering right at. In fact, I'll check my phone here while I'm talking. I know it was at like 98 or so when I started this video, I think. Yeah, Bitcoin's at 98K right now. But recently it was up to 108. It's dipped. I think it dipped back to like 91 recently, and so it's kind of been in that 90 to 108 range a little bit. At 100K, then MicroStrategy is sitting on almost $45 billion with a B in Bitcoin. So that already, we can say, no way in heck is that a Ponzi scheme. I did look, and I'm going to show you a little bit here in a minute, as of September 30th. So that was kind of the last quarterly filing. MicroStrategy had about $4 billion in debt. So if they had $4 billion in debt, and just this asset alone is more than 10x that, of course, they've taken on more debt since then, so we'll have to look at that in the next filing. But let's say they're at like 8 or 9x their debt. That is not so leveraged at 1/9, let's say, or something like that, of just this asset, and that's not to speak of their revenue. If you look at people like Citadel or Bank of America, I showed my followers once the country of Japan. If we looked at the federal government in the U.S., those are groups that are far, 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 far more leveraged. In some cases, multiple hundreds of leverage. So if MicroStrategy is several hundred times healthier or deleveraged compared to some of those groups, it doesn't seem to hold water to say, that they've over leveraged themselves. And we're going to actually click in on that as well and talk about that because liquidity or solvency has to do with even just being able to pay your bills, right? So we got to look at what is the actual cost of their debt. And we will. So anyway, if they hold at $100,000 Bitcoin price, if MicroStrategy held $45 billion of Bitcoin, then if I only valued their stock based on a snapshot of the Bitcoin price and how much they hold, the stock would be worth 183. Now, it was well over 300 today. So there's where some will try to get you focused and say, well, if this is what the Bitcoin is worth, that's why it's overvalued. But hang on, because we need to look through the overall value of the company and talk about there's more than just today's value of Bitcoin. So first off, let's look at the other scenarios on this page, because it has long been my point of view that, I'm definitely very, very bullish on Bitcoin. And I'll talk in a minute why that is and what I see coming over the next couple of years. And so part of any company, when you're valuing a stock, is a forward view, right? That's why you get things like a price to earnings ratio. Many companies are valued, the overall S&P 500, for example. If you took the top 500 companies, the price to earnings ratio right now is probably, I'm going to make this up, 24, 25 years or something on the overall S&P 500, which is historically high, by the way, and maybe it's even higher than that right now. Historically, you want the S&P 500 kind of more at like 19 to 20 years. And then there's plenty of companies like an Amazon or something that are probably, if I was to look, valued at like 60 or 70 years of earnings. So if you were to look forward, let's just use like even a 20-year view. Now, I'm kind of mixing apples and oranges when I say that, because price to earnings, as you can hear, is about actual revenue over above expenses. It's about earnings that are coming in, and you'll price in a certain amount of years of effectively cash flow. With Bitcoin, this is more like looking at a bank or an insurance company or something. Well, with MicroStrategy, because they're holding an asset. But hold that thought, because we're going to talk about how the asset could become productive in the future as well. And I think Saylor has been more than hinting at that and talking a lot about what's to come. And I think that matters as well. But there's some kind of forward value of Bitcoin, is what I'm really getting at. You don't buy a stock for its value today. You're hoping to realize some value in the future. So let's look at what happens if Bitcoin goes up. So you can see here at 125K, then MicroStrategy's Bitcoin goes up another more than $11 billion. And then at 150K, it's up to 67, and on and on. And so you could just screenshot this or do your own math with a calculator sometime. And you can see as it goes up in value, and I've just kind of jumped at the end to $5 million. But if you were to look ahead 10, 20 years, it's not hard to believe. Saylor has talked about 13 million. I think it's Van Eck is a big global investment group. They've talked about even higher than that. There are various groups talking in the millions, and especially if you think like say 20 years into the future, it is really not hard to imagine a world where that happens. And so, frankly, I think this would even be very conservative if I was talking 20 years from now. I've told my followers, if you're catching this video because you're interested in MicroStrategy or Bitcoin and you're new to me, I have 3 children. My oldest is not quite 19. My youngest just turned 11. And my 3 children, I am getting them in Bitcoin. In fact, my oldest has a little bit of a job while he's in school, and he just puts in a little bit at a time. And I've told him, do that the rest of your life. Just keep putting in a little bit at a time, and you're going to be very happy over the many years. I've long said that Bitcoin, it's not for people who are interested in sort of day to day, unless you're just an amazing trader. I personally would not try to time Bitcoin. I'm just in it for a very long haul, and I'm basically a hodler, and I'm teaching my kids to do that because I believe in what you're seeing on this page. And I will explain why in a minute, so it's not just some kind of hopium. But you can see what that would do to MicroStrategy's prices. So even if you wanted to look forward, I don't know, just 2 or 3 or 4 years, it's probably going to get to 500K. That would put MicroStrategy's just today's holdings of Bitcoin, and not valuing the rest of MicroStrategy as a company would make it almost $1,000 stock. That's like 3x what it was today. So it's just not hard to imagine a world. So if you're valuing into the future, it's a little hard to argue that MicroStrategy is overvalued unless you believe Bitcoin itself is overvalued and it's going to go backwards and not forwards. But hang on to that thought too, and we'll talk about that more. Let's go ahead and actually look at the debt. One of the talking points of the shorts, as I mentioned, is that they're over leveraged, and how are they going to maintain all this debt without bringing in new so-called bag holders? Well, all these convertible notes, you need to understand, first of all, that the really, really major financial players are actually not charging MicroStrategy much in the way of interest. Look at these interest rates. 650 million aggregate principal amount of 0.75%. Here's 0%. Here's, I don't know, not quite 2/3%. Here's about a little over 0.75%, and then there's some that's at 2.25%. Well, a lot of these are almost at 0 or even are at 0%. Companies are just saying, listen, I just want these shares and I want into the Bitcoin market. And we'll talk about who those companies are and why Saylor, did that. He effectively has opened the door to a lot of companies who can't necessarily just directly hold Bitcoin for themselves, and sort of the corporate bond market and the insurance market. And there are companies that I'm going to show you in just a minute who those are, who are getting in big numbers. There's a reason he keeps opening up and doing more shares. The shares are funding these convertible notes, which are letting all these companies buy Bitcoin. And then I'm getting ahead of myself, but there's some value then that MicroStrategy can sort of derive from that and create value for its shareholders. Now, that would be your thesis if you're long, and I'll talk about how that works just a little bit. So this right here, you need to know this if someone is a short and says, well, they have all this debt, they're screwed. Well, look at the interest rates of that debt. And in some cases, it's literally 0%. It's not costing them. So, it is costing them dilution. That would be something else you need to think through as a shareholder is how do you feel about that dilution? But if that dilution continues to add massive amounts of Bitcoin, which let's go back right now, almost 450,000 Bitcoin, that you see the value of what that's going to be in the future, depending on whatever price you want to use, it seems like that dilution is driving value creation. And my followers have heard me talk about value creation quite a bit. In the most recent quarter, here's the actual interest expense that MicroStrategy had. It was $18 million. By the way, they had about $12 million in revenue. So yes, that means negative cash flow, but that does not concern me personally when they're sitting on, at today's value, $45 billion of Bitcoin. You need a couple $1,000,000, you sell a couple Bitcoin or something. And hang on again, because we're going to talk about how Bitcoin may start generating cash without having to sell it. So let's come back to that. So who would buy these? A 2 trillion euro asset manager, for one. So if you don't know Allianz, I'm sure most of you do. There's even Allianz Stadium. I want to say that's in Atlanta, right? Anyway, so Allianz is massive. They manage over $2 trillion of total assets. That's the chart up at the top right. This is actually in euro, so over 2 trillion euro. And they're Germany's biggest insurer, and they're one of the largest companies in the world. Well, you can see this was a headline from back in March. You can see March 2024. They had bought fully a quarter of one of the offerings that Saylor had offered, that MicroStrategy had offered. So you can see they at this time they bought 150 million dollars of those notes. So if you're seeing $2 trillion asset managers jump in and say, sure, I'll plunk down $150 million on this one shot to MicroStrategy. That does not sound like the type of people who just throw their money away or put their money behind poor management, right? So that is certainly a vote from a very large financial institution who is saying, yep, I believe in what Saylor's doing. I want in on this. And that's just one example I'm just showing you. You can go find who else has been getting in, but it is some very, very large players. So I don't know. Good luck to the shorts betting against these kind of people. Here's some of the things, though, I would say you want to think about with MicroStrategy. So I've already talked about what's the forward value. Actually, no, I haven't talked about really the forward value of their revenue. I mentioned in the last quarter they had about $12 million of revenue. In 2023, the full year, they had like $56 million. I think based on recent business, they're probably tracking more around $50 million in revenue yearly. So back to the Ponzi idea. This is a company with actual revenue. It's a software company, and you can see there's licenses, there's subscriptions, there's IP, there's ongoing services. So there is a real business there. But then, of course, Saylor has dwarfed that with basically what he's building as kind of becoming a Bitcoin bank. You need to think through what's the future yield of Bitcoin purchases. So if you go through any MicroStrategy earnings report, or if you see Saylor's tweets, he will talk about yield. So effectively, MicroStrategy in a way is kind of getting a deal on Bitcoin and creating yield by basically buying it, at lower prices than what they end up holding. And so effectively, they're creating shareholder value in the purchase of their Bitcoin. So that is just one form of yield. We're going to talk about another one in a minute. Volatility. So that is part of the thing that Saylor is actually providing to these markets. A lot of these markets are sort of stuck in very vanilla, very plain Jane assets, and volatility. If you're a top level trader, and certainly at a financial institution who has all the resources to trade, volatility can be your friend. You can make a lot of money off of volatility, trading up and trading down. And so that is a value that Saylor is providing to the financial world and to his shareholders. The fact that I believe, now I'm speculating here, but this is me just sort of with an eye to the future, that effectively MicroStrategy at some point is going to become a Bitcoin banker. And so then the next bullet after, just think of the future instruments that you're going to see in Bitcoin. And it's already starting. You're going to see ways that Bitcoin is going to be monetized as an asset. and is going to generate cash flows. That's what you do in the financial world. If you have an asset, you find ways to create cash flows using that asset. You're going to see all kinds of new financial instruments from Bitcoin. There's already even like bond ETFs and various things that are coming. You're going to see Bitcoin being used to back all kinds of finances and generate cash. So it's not just sitting there as an asset, it's going to be an asset that probably starts to become cash generating. And then you're going to have to think about all kinds of new valuations for that, um, and sort of old school financial thinking in a very new paradigm. The two will kind of come together. And Saylor sees that. He's a visionary and he sees that. And I believe I see it as well, just not as well as him. But so, don't sleep on the fact that he's not sitting on his hands. He's figuring out ways to monetize this 450,000 units of perhaps the most valuable asset in the world that he's currently sitting on. And then MicroStrategy has some kind of brand value. Just if you were ever, valuing a business, you need to think about all the pieces of value generation. And then Bitcoin itself, I've mentioned it's going to go up. Just on the fact that fiat currencies are constantly being debased, you can find a whole video I did on debasement. On that fact alone, Bitcoin is going up, even if nobody did anything. Just against the dollar, against the euro, against the Brazilian real, et cetera, it's going to go up because central banks have a sort of corrupt, broken system. And Saylor talks a lot about that, and I happen to agree with him. And a lot of the conclusions I came to before I ever heard him say them, which actually gives me all the much more confidence that various minds are thinking the same way on Bitcoin, and it is an exit from the toxic, poisonous world of fiat currencies. And so you need to think about what's the future appreciation of Bitcoin. And besides just the fact that it naturally will go up because the money printer go burr, you need to also know what else is coming with Bitcoin. And that relates to MicroStrategy, or it relates to if you want to invest in Bitcoin itself. There are 11 United States that are currently discussing adding Bitcoin as a reserve for their state. Like Texas, as an example, is one of those. And so you need to think through when it's not just somebody like Saylor purchasing all these billions of dollars of Bitcoin, when it is 11 US states or perhaps more who start doing that and putting it on their balance sheets. And you know that Trump and team have been talking about Bitcoin as a strategic reserve. Bobby Kennedy was talking about that. So, there is a lot of discussion on the United States federal government adding Bitcoin as a strategic reserve. No idea how many coins that would be. And now go back to the title slide of this, I don't know, I'll call it presentation or whatever I'm doing here. Saylor just went to Mar-a-Lago and met with Eric Trump and had a discussion. You can read between the lines on that. I have a feeling that they are asking his thoughts and opinions because he's the expert, or an expert certainly, in this space. Probably the expert. I'm not sure. There certainly are a lot of people who've done very deep DD on Bitcoin, and I respect all of you. Side note, someone who had done their DD on Bitcoin, sort of led me. If I was a horse, they led me to that water, and I did take a drink. So thank you. You know who you are if you ever listen to this. Really appreciate your patience and you showing me, I was pointed in directions really and had to do my own DD. And I think that was really valuable. If you're out there and you ever want to teach some people, someone taught me how to fish, if you just use that saying. So, and it made me a believer in Bitcoin. I got there on my own with some guidance rather than someone saying, trust me, bro. It's just a lot more powerful to come to your own realizations. And then there are other countries talking about purchasing Bitcoin, including some really interesting ones. You just go take a look, Google that. There's a lot of countries talking about purchasing Bitcoin. Switzerland as well, by the way. There's some discussion there on whether Switzerland would purchase. Japan has been talking about it. Certainly there are whales out there, probably in secret in some cases, not necessarily broadcasting what they're doing, but purchasing Bitcoin. I told you already about the money printer. We know about the debt spiral in a lot of countries right now. All of that's going to have to be dealt with. Again, go look at my video on debasement, or a whole video I did about sort of the price of gold and silver and Bitcoin versus things like groceries and car insurance. There is probably a time of inflation coming, and inflation is basically the debasement of your currency. I like to tell my children, your stuff is not really costing more, it's that your money is worth less. Well, Bitcoin doesn't do that. So if Bitcoin's not going to be debased, then it's naturally going to be worth more dollars and more euro and more real and yuan and yen and et cetera, et cetera. Um, and then I mentioned that I believe a time is coming very shortly where you're going to start to see a lot of sort of banking and financial instruments being driven by Bitcoin uh, to monetize that asset. And so that's going to be really interesting when, if Bitcoin becomes a productive asset besides just a store of value, um, that's going to be a game changer, and I think it's coming. And by the way, I have some background in global trade. I worked, if you're new to me, I worked for a Dow Jones company for 21 years. And for about 4 years, I'm more of an operations and planning and forecasting guy. But for about 4 years, I led a big project, which kind of was around foreign exchange and global trade and tax and all of that. And so, one thing I've thought a lot about is um, people talk about Bitcoin being really volatile. Well, I like to say, or you would have seen if you follow me on X, it's not volatile against itself. One Bitcoin is always worth one Bitcoin. So, what do you think happens when global commerce potentially is ever facilitated in Bitcoin? You effectively get rid of all foreign exchange volatility. Take a look at some international companies and their earnings, and look for things. You just go out and Google FX headwind and FX tailwind. It is a constant concern of large companies that foreign exchange rates can turn against you. I've mentioned, even say, some of my AMC followers. AMC owns Odeon and UCI and some other things in Europe. You're translating your European sales back into dollars, and when the dollar goes, sort of the wrong way, let's say, against the euro, then you're making your European business look smaller. You're translating it into less dollars. Well, what happens if you were to denominate your business in Bitcoin, and now you don't have to do all that translation, and you now get rid of risk? You're de-risking your company. That was the project I led for that large company. We effectively cut our what's called notional foreign exchange risk in half. Wall Street doesn't love risk. Risk is priced into stocks as well, so that it's kind of an intangible, but it's priced in. If people can't predict the future, they don't like that. And so, if you get rid of foreign exchange risk, I just think that could be really interesting as a use case for Bitcoin. If someday it sort of facilitates global commerce, we're a long way from that probably, but I don't know. I'm a bit of a futurist. I like to think about things like that. All right, and then so for my followers, sometimes I like to sneak little things in there. I'm just gonna leave this one as everything is gonna be all right. Hope you all have a great weekend. I guess it's hard for me not to finish with this will be more for AMC and GameStop folks, but we will win. Let's go.